The following is a non-profit fan reading that is not officially associated with Neil Peart, his family, his publisher, or the other members of Rush. Out of respect for the author, the entirety of the original text will not be presented here. If you would like to learn more about Neil Peart, his written works, or the music of Rush, please click the links in the description. Chapter 2. Westering. What a fool I used to be. The truest words I ever wrote. And they get truer every day. During the winter of 1994, I was away working with Rush on our Counterparts tour, so all I could do was read the motorcycle magazines while I dreamed about riding that beautiful red beast I had gotten for Christmas. In April, I attended a writing class at a Toronto college with Rush guitarist Alex Lifeson, who had been bitten by the bug himself that same winter and had bought a Harley-Davidson. A strange and ironic part of my physical-mental interface was that although I had made my living playing drums for 20 years, with hands and feet doing this and that and the other thing, more or less independently of one another, all my life I had trouble with physical coordination. Sports, for example, at which I had always been very poor. I attempted to comfort this wounded self-image by theorizing that while playing the drums, I had to divide my limbs in a kind of four-way independence, and thus it was more like discoordination, but of course that didn't really wash, for they all had to work together eventually. In any case, even on the small motorcycles provided by the riding school, I had difficulty coordinating the balance of clutch and throttle controls, and I struggled rather pathetically for the 3 days of the program. Alex was already a licensed pilot by then and something of a natural athlete, so he aced the final test easily, but I failed on that first attempt. I felt humiliated and dismayed, and even more so when I failed on my second try during the next break in the tour. Before my third attempt, I finally engaged an instructor for a private lesson, and he quickly helped me understand my difficulties and correct them. How proud and happy, and relieved I was when I finally passed that riding test. It was another quality of my physical-mental interface that any activity in which I developed an interest became an obsession. This had been true of playing the drums, reading every great book ever written, writing lyrics, writing prose, cross-country skiing, bicycling, and now, motorcycling. Selena and Jackie and I spent that whole summer of 1994 at the house on the lake, and several mornings a week I got up before dawn and went riding for a couple of hours on the empty, winding roads of the Laurentians, slowly gaining skill and confidence. That summer, we had friends renting a cottage on a nearby lake. Jackie's best friend Georgia, her husband Brutus, and their son Sam. At that time, Brutus and I were friends in the my wife's friend's husband sense, but when he saw me having so much fun with my new motorcycle, he went out and bought one of his own, a BMW K1100RS. That September, he joined me on my first motorcycle journey through Quebec, Newfoundland, and the Maritime provinces, and we met up with Jackie and Georgia in Nova Scotia. They flew into Halifax and rented a car. Neither of them seemed to enjoy riding behind us on the motorcycles, at least farther than to the store for a newspaper. They said they didn't like being cramped, overdressed, uncomfortable, and cold. To follow us for a few days around the Cabot Trail on Cape Breton Island and back to Halifax. Hence, they flew home while Brutus and I rode back to Quebec. Brutus and I discovered two important things on that first trip together. We liked traveling by motorcycle, and we liked traveling together. He gave our two-man gang the name Scooter Trash, and we began to spin more dreams and plans for adventures together. In the spring of 1995, we shipped our bikes to Mexico for a 3-week tour, where Brutus crashed and broke a couple of ribs, then later set his luggage cases on fire, and in the early summer of that year, we squeezed in another adventure. We both had the time professionally, for I was between tours and Brutus was a self-employed entrepreneur, but there was some serious bargaining and bribery going on between our families. That June, we set off across Canada on a 2-week blast up Yellowknife in Canada's Northwest Territories, where both of us fell over in the mud repeatedly, a story published at the Catching Some Midnight Rays in Cycle Canada magazine, before rejoining our families for that summer in Quebec. My birthday present from Jackie that September was a card reading 7 Days of Freedom, and we took advantage of that, and Georgia's resignation to ride east again to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. After another winter of work and family time, in the spring of 1996, we shipped the bikes across the Atlantic to Munich, where we began another 3-week tour through Bavaria and the Austrian Alps, where Brutus crashed, Italy, Sicily, and Tunisia, where Brutus broke down in the middle of the Sahara, and back through Sardinia, France, and Switzerland. But all of that was just preparation for the really big tour. During the summer of 1996, plans were coming together for Rush's Test for Echo concert tour, which would eventually span 67 shows in the United States and Canada. I began to think about how I was going to endure yet another rock tour, which I'd always perceived as a combination of crushing tedium, constant exhaustion, and circus-like insanity, none of which suited my restless, independent, and private temperament. Paradoxically, I enjoyed the preparation for a tour, for I liked rehearsing with the band with the shared intensity of working towards the perfect show, and the first few shows certainly got the adrenaline pumping when we hit the stage in front of 10 or 12,000 people in a big arena. However, by about the third show, we would get it right. The band and crew and audience locked together in a transcendent performance, and as far as I was concerned, that was it. If my job was to play a good show, then I had done it. Goal achieved, challenge met, case dismissed. Can I go home now? Nothing is ever that simple, of course, but it felt to me that for the rest of the tour, I would only be going up there night after night and trying to repeat that experience at best. Not to say that was simple either. When a particular show fell short of that standard, I felt deflated and disgusted with myself. While if I played well enough to meet that benchmark, it was only what I expected of myself, nothing to get excited about. So for me, touring could be a long, relentless grind, exhausting and soul-destroying. And that only refers to the on-stage time, a small fraction of the chaos of traveling, waiting, and shifting from hotel to bus to arena to hotel for months on end. For several tours through the 80s and early 90s, I carried a bicycle with me on the tour bus, which had provided a great escape and diversion. During the days off between shows, I might spend the whole day riding from city to city, if they were within 100 miles or so, and on the afternoons before a show, I often pedaled through the various cities to the local art museum to feed my growing interest in paintings, art history, and African carvings. This time I was thinking about how the motorcycle would make it possible for me to cover some real distances, and I conceived of a plan using a tour bus with a trailer for the motorcycles, and convinced Brutus to join me on the tour as navigator, machine supervisor, and most importantly, riding companion. From the tour's opening show in Albany, New York, we made our own journey around the band's itinerary, eventually riding around 40,000 miles in nearly every state in the lower 48, except only North Dakota for some reason, which never seemed to cross our path, and several Canadian provinces. The main logo of that Test for Echo tour was taken from the cover art of the album, which portrayed a humanoid icon of piled stones, a gigantic version of an Inuit Inukshuk, which means in the likeness of man. My suggestion that we use this image had been inspired by that long ride up to Yellowknife the previous year, when I had seen one of the most mystical-looking cairns of rock overlooking the remote northern town, at the very edge of the true wilderness. Knowing that these stone figures traditionally mark travel and hunting routes across the barren Arctic, I had been struck by the power of this human symbol in a hostile land. Now, just over a year after the final show of the Test for Echo tour, which we played in Ottawa on July 4th, 1997, it was the dark summer of 1998. And everything was changed so very much, at least through my eyes. I was riding again, but I was riding alone, motivated partly by my desire to see if solitary traveling might help to soothe the torment of my little baby soul, and partly because Brutus couldn't get away and was hoping to meet up with me sometime later on. On the first day of my journey westward from Quebec, I saw a small Inukshuk placed at the roadside, high on a rocky cut, and then another the second day, and again on the third. Perhaps they had been assembled by another solitary traveler, a hitchhiker passing time until the next ride came along. A good omen, I'd like to think, although it gave me a wry smile to think about that definition. In the likeness of man. For that was surely how I felt, so hollow and dispirited that I could hardly imagine what it would be like to be the fool that I used to be. Sometimes I tried to steer my mind away from memories of the past, but in other moods they now seem so remote, so unreal, that I could dare to think about the past without breaking down. The ghost of summer past took me back to the summer of 1996, probably the most productive time of my life. Test for Echo had just been released, and I considered it to be my masterpiece as a drummer, for I had worked hard on my playing during the 2 years prior to those sessions. That summer I was settling the post-production details of an instructional video on drumming, a work in progress, and at the same time correcting the proofs for my first published book, The Masked Rider. I had made an agreement with Jackie and Selena that I could work in my office until noon, then stop and spend the afternoons and evenings with them. Fair enough. Just 2 summers later, all that was ashes, and I felt little connection with any of those accomplishments. My current struggles weren't about creating or producing, or planning adventures, only surviving. When I reflected on that old life, I tended to think of the protagonist as that guy, for I only shared his memories, and some of those memories I was now trying to hide from, escape from, ride away from. I could ride, but I couldn't hide. I was away before 6 o'clock on a cold morning, riding past hay farms, scrub forest, and some bald-looking areas of clear cut. A road sign informed me that some of these had been cut to fight against a parasite on the spruce trees and to eliminate the stands of deadwood left behind. Magpies, crows, a coyote, and a fox kept me company as I covered 250 kilometers before stopping for gas and breakfast in Dawson Creek, British Columbia. The poor, violated GS backfired a few times when I downshifted, but seemed to be running smoothly again. I noticed my thumb was sore from working the starter button so much trying to get it started the previous day, and that made me worry about the starter itself. I hoped its brushes and windings hadn't been worn too badly by all that abuse. We were now officially getting out there, for a sign in Dawson Creek announced Mile Zero of the Alaska Highway, and there was no BMW dealer until the other end of it in Fairbanks over 1,000 miles away. The morning remained cold, and a light overcast let through just enough glare to require sunglasses. A steady 75 miles per hour was fast enough to cover the miles, though still moderately legal, but I was soon feeling bone-chilled, even with my heated vest, wired like an electric blanket and plugged into the bike's electrics, the heated grips under my heavy gloves, and my plastic rain suit over my leathers. In Fort Nelson, I stopped at the pantry for a bowl of soup and a chance to warm myself, and wrote in my journal, "The best two-lane highway you can imagine so far. Wide, well-paved, lightly traveled, some nice bits of scenery, but I know the spectacular stuff will just be starting as I head west into the mountains." I also saw an RV bumper sticker that said, "Where are we going and why are we in this handbasket?" Back beside my motorcycle in the parking lot, I dug out my emergency cell phone and called Sheila, the band's bookkeeper, back at our office in Toronto. Sheila had been part of our family life in past times, for she used to come to our house to update our books every 2 weeks, on Tuesday evenings, the same night as Selena's flute lesson, when the house would be filled with the rich chords of the teacher's piano accompaniment and Selena's sometimes halting performances. Like her father, she loved to play, but with an impatience more like her mother's, she hated to practice. Sheila had been a dear and supportive friend through all of my troubles, and I had taken advantage of her kindness by gradually shifting all of my business to her desk and making her my central liaison for messages from friends and family. I might have been a solitary traveler, feeling completely detached from everything around me, but I was never really alone. Always there were people thinking of me, worrying about me, and looking after the necessary business of my abandoned life. When my whole world was pulled out from under me so completely, I was left feeling so flat and weak and helpless that I was unable to cope with the details of everyday life at all, and had to accept the help that was offered so willingly by family and friends. Once I was able to accept the idea, I was amazed how much they would and could do to help me survive those dark days. John Steinbeck once wrote that sometimes the nicest thing you can do for someone is to allow them to do something for you, and I learned that truth of that insight too. For perhaps the first time in my life, I surrendered my independence and my proud self-sufficiency, and once I'd opened that window to the warm breeze of compassion, my worldview was utterly transformed. I fell into their open arms. My brother Danny was one of those caregivers, and he sent me a quote from Thoreau. "At death, our friends and relatives either draw nearer to us and are found out, or depart farther from us and are forgotten." Nearly everyone close to me had drawn nearer through that time, and one day in the house of mourning, I remember saying to my friend Brad, "You know, I used to think life is great, but people suck. Now I've had to learn the opposite. Life sucks, but people are great." In my former shallow, perhaps callous worldview, I had enjoyed my life and appreciated my family and friends, but I'd often been annoyed by that feeling that everyone else just wanted something from me. But now life, which I had once idealized as a generous deity offering adventure and delight, had betrayed my faith viciously. And in that aftermath, it was people who had held me up and held me together with unstinting care and unimagined affection. With regard to unimagined affection, I confess I'm one of those people who, in a deep and secret place, can never imagine why anyone would actually like them. Respect maybe, or even appreciate, but not really care for. This psychology, or psychosis or neurosis, is not about self-esteem or pride, for most people seem to profess sufficient reserves of those qualities, or some facsimile thereof. But it is more a sense of one's ineptitude in the social graces, a perceived disability in what seem to be the normal social routines of being charming, funny, entertaining, and forthcoming with another person. This existential discomfort causes more social awkwardness than the contrary self-image, as evinced by one friend of mine who, in that same deep and secret place, can't imagine why anyone wouldn't like him. And for those of us who feel deficient in such socially valued qualities, it can also be that the effort of opening up ourselves to another is so difficult that we're willing to at least attempt the operation in close friendships, but not casual encounters. That part of me remained the same, it seems. But I had learned that it would be worthwhile to try to give yourself to others. They had certainly given themselves to me. Even some who had never been that close to me before were moved, and I remembered one former employee of the band's who I hadn't seen for years showing up at the house of mourning and tearfully rambling through a speech that basically expressed what many others must have felt. I don't know what to say, but here's my heart.